We acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the gathering grounds of many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose footsteps have marked this land and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Hello and welcome back to Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey Johnson, and today we are joined by Teddy Carter. Teddy Carter is a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta with roots in the Michelle Band, which is currently in negotiations for reinstatement with the Canadian government. She is an assistant professor in the MacEwan School of Business and a PhD student in the Alberta School of Business, living in Amiskwaciy-Waskahigan. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Teddy.
Thank you for having me. It's really exciting.
Yeah, no, we're excited to have you and learn more about what you're doing here. So I thought to start, I was hoping you could just give us a brief sort of overview of your research here at MacEwan.
Sure. So Tansei, Teddy Carter, Netsi Kesa, and I'm a Squasi Utinia. So I'm Teddy Carter. I'm from Edmonton. So my community that I'm closest to in Edmonton is the Michelle Band. That's the band that my grandfather was a part of before it was enfranchised. And that community is Cree, Métis, and Mohawk. A lot of people really go strong for the Mohawk or the Métis part, but there's lots of intermarriage between the three groups. And I'm learning a little bit of Cree all the time. My current Cree teacher is Lloyd Martin. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Lloyd. Don't know if he'll ever hear this, but still. And I've had lots of really wonderful Cree teachers for years and years. So just wanted to acknowledge the land in Cree. So my research, an overview of my research. Right now, like the kind of most current recent project is a project to look at bringing land-based learning into business. So I'm an associate professor in the School of Business. I was just hired last year, and my official title is assistant professor. I should say associate because that's a little more advanced. But so I'm an assistant professor of Indigenous Knowledges in Strategy and International Business. That's my title, and I'm cross-appointed with Kiyuwachistan, which is the Eagle's Nest. That's the Indigenous Service Center on campus. So I work between those two groups, which is kind of like, I can't even believe that I got like such an amazing position within my own community area, and so I get to stay living at home instead of moving away as most professors have to do to get jobs. So the research itself, it's a land-based learning kind of project, seeing how that can integrate into a business school. And there's a few parts to it. The first part is a lot of universities and business schools have been a little slow to the uptake, but they're starting to realize now we need to indigenize what we're doing. Like, we have a responsibility to Indigenous peoples in Canada, to economic reconciliation in Canada. So we need to start meeting those responsibilities. And that's really closely tied to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. So there's quite a few of them, and hopefully nobody gets too mad at me, but I'm blanking on if it's call 92 or 94 that talks about the importance of the business community in stepping up to reconciliation. So there's a direct call to the business community to do that. So that's a part of what I'm trying to do, and I think what the business school is trying to do in bringing me in, and my position is a little more research focused instead of being teaching heavy, at least at this point. And what I've always wanted to do since I began teaching, I started teaching when I was still well, I still am a PhD student, but when I was a PhD student at the U of A, I began teaching Introduction to Indigenous Business as kind of like a boutique course. And I realized that it really, like, from an Indigenous teaching standpoint, sitting in a classroom and having a person stand in front of you, um, it's hard to connect to the concepts that way, or, develop a good relationship with your community, with the land, with the culture by sitting in a classroom. So you can, but there are ways to intervene in that or resist that kind of like dynamic within a classroom that separates students from their community or separates, what we do in academia from the land. So I started thinking I really want to do a land-based learning course. And then when I came here, I kind of just initiated the project by looking into, what are they doing so far for land-based learning at MacEwan, or what have I heard about through the grapevine for land-based learning? And I developed a project proposal. And then just this summer, I had a summer student, Jason Hudson, shout out to Jason Hudson, helping me out, doing some kind of research assistant work for me on the project. I don't know if that goes in the direction you were looking for, but yeah, feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think just from that, I'm curious, how would you, I guess, me not being a business student, and not knowing kind of what entails in a business classroom, how does land-based learning kind of play into that business education?
Mm-hmm. So traditionally in business schools, you learn kind of the components of what it means to run a business in order to make profit. So that's things like how to manage people, how to manage your supply chain, how to market to your customers, how to do your accounting and finance. And as you're learning these things as a student in a business school, you're constantly thinking that your end goal is profit. So that's like what they call the bottom line. If you're not making profit, then get out, you're going to fail. And in more recent years, related to environmental degradation, human rights issues, so on and so forth, business has turned more towards a sustainable focus, not just sustainable as in like, how can we sustain our business, but realizing that businesses are embedded within communities and ecosystems. So they have to operate in a way that supports that community or that ecosystem. It can't just be like money, 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 money. We need to be a little more aware of the context that we sit in as business people. So there's an increasing focus on how to create a sustainable business that contributes socially, that contributes to, or at least doesn't continue environmental degradation if it can't, do things to benefit the environment. And I think I don't want to align land-based learning with sustainable business and say they're the same things, because land-based learning, from my perspective, is rooted in Indigenous beliefs, Indigenous language, Indigenous ceremony, of a local, geographically based community and an Indigenous community, whereas sustainability is kind of like a very broad concept or a broad set of ideas that can be applied similarly across the board. And it's not something that's been developed by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples. So land-based learning, you had mentioned earlier land-based economies. What are land-based economies? So thinking back to, say, pre-contact, and when I say pre-contact, I mean like before settler colonialism in North America. We know that there were complex trade systems. People didn't just, barely get by. There were thriving economies based on gifting. If you've ever heard of the potlatch ceremony, I'm not sure. Have you heard of the potlatch ceremony?
I have not. No.
Have you heard of a potluck?
Yes.
Okay, so what happens in a potluck?
Potluck, everybody brings a dish and you just kind of share everything.
Right, so like this kind of concept of sharing. So a potlatch is sort of like a similar concept, but I can elaborate on what it actually, well, I'm not a potlatch expert, and I'm not from a community that originally did potlatches. So this is a tradition from the West Coast, like Salish people, Haida, etc. So potlatch was a ceremony of wealth redistribution. So whoever the family or the leader of the community was who had the most stuff, that they had, built the most canoes or tanned the most hides, caught the most and smoked the most fish, whoever had all of that stuff, they then had like a big ceremony, and a part of the ceremony was to redistribute all that stuff throughout the community, and that was connected to their, how people respected them within their community. So that's something that I would think about in terms of like a land-based economy, or a traditional land-based economy, or even like connecting it to, say, protocol. So when you go to an elder or a knowledge keeper, there's a protocol that you follow, and a lot of the time that includes giving tobacco when you're asking for what it is you're hoping the elder knowledge keeper can tell you. And that's an economy, right? Where, I mean, like in current times that we live in, you have to go and purchase that tobacco with money, and maybe that costs $25, $50, and then you give that over to the knowledge keeper or elder who's agreed to help you. But okay, the connection is that there's some sort of like trade, some sort of like exchange of service that shows respect for both nature, because if you can't, get your hands on tobacco because you haven't, like respected the land, so there's no tobacco growing, you harvested it all in 1 year and didn't, leave some to grow for following years, then you're kind of like out of relation with the land, and that disrupts that economy. It's kind of like a simple example, but I think an important one, because so many people don't understand the importance of protocol.
Yeah, no, for sure. So just with this whole like kind of intersection between Indigenous ways of knowing and learning and land-based learning with our like Western sort of business ideals, how did that research start for you? Like, what inspired you to go down this path?
Okay, so why did I go down this path? So, like, honestly, as a young person, okay, like, to preface this, like, I came from a very, like, financially not good background. Like, we were definitely, like, statistics in terms of, like, people living in low-income housing, not having a lot of money, being on government social services, stuff like that. And at the same time, like, I honestly, business was the last thing on my mind, is in terms of, like, a career to pursue. I more so was interested in, like, making stuff, like making art, making stories, stuff like that. But I would try to sell them. And like, I guess that is like, I did always have like a little bit of like a business mind, or like when I had toys I didn't want anymore, I'd have like these little toy sales on my front porch for the neighborhood kids. So I recognized there was like something going on there. But yeah, like I just was really stressed about money a lot as a young person. And at the same time, like not super skilled at how to manage money or, get myself in a position where I wasn't, stressing or feeling like I had to really keep like such a close eye on every cent, that kind of thing. And then coinciding with that, I grew up in an urban environment, so like I wasn't close to Indigenous communities. Like I lived in Millwoods, and like there are Indigenous peoples in Millwoods, but at least at the time I was growing up, there wasn't a lot of support for Indigenous people. Like honestly, there wasn't a lot of support until maybe the TRC took place in Canada. Like people really said like horrible things. They didn't care. They had a lot of prejudices, and there wasn't a lot of education out there, like public awareness to kind of help mediate those ways of thinking in the mainstream consciousness. So it wasn't something that was supported. Like now, I think Indigenous kids are getting a lot more support in schools in terms of like being connected to culture, but I didn't have a lot of support. Like basically it was my mom just teaching me and my sister what she knew about, valuing the land, having respect for the land, the importance of that, and our relationship to the land, and, taking us out berry picking, taking us out mushroom foraging, that kind of stuff. But I just, like I've always felt my indigeneity pretty deeply, and I think it's because my mom really does feel and has always felt her indigeneity very deeply. So it's something that I've always wanted to, be immersed in, if possible, instead of feeling like kind of separate from it. So I guess it's like kind of like a melding of those two things, those like really early drivers that like what would Freud or Jung call it, like your super ego, those voices that like will be in your head forever, that maybe it's my mom's voice in my head forever, just like always driving me towards sort of like, it sucks to be poor. And it like, I really want to be connected to, my Indigenous community and the culture and the values. And I think both of those things are just kind of like lifelong journeys that I'm on. Like it'll never be, maybe I'll get to a point where I'm just like, okay, I don't have to worry about money. Like, especially now that I'm working, I'm not a student anymore. It's like way better because probably, like money is tight when you're a student.
Money is tight.
Yeah, and I've been a student for a long time, so now that I'm kind of like getting out of that struggle, maybe it will ease off, but it's also like, just, when you kind of go through that sort of stuff, it imprints on you in a way where you're like, I don't want other people to go through that. So for me, that's like, I hate the idea of like Indigenous kids feeling like they're less important because they don't have money, or feeling like they don't have access to, security in life because they don't have money. But, like statistically, that's the case, that, Indigenous peoples are marginalized in the Canadian economy. And so, like, how do you deal with that when not only are you marginalized by the mainstream economic system, but also like your traditional land-based economics, like some of the stuff I was talking to you about before, have been completely, like there's been such an intense effort to erase those things by the Canadian government. So I don't have the total answers, but it's like that's where my brain is kind of oriented. So that's what leads me down this path.
Yeah, and now like you had mentioned, like now you're here and you get to be a part of this community and actually work within it, which I think is really amazing, and I'm so glad that you get to do that. I know, just from like what I've read and what you've said before, that a huge part of your research involves around this idea of self-location. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about that to us or for us.
Yeah, so like how did I get into self-location? Well, I mentioned business is kind of slow to the uptake of indigenization compared to other disciplines. So like obviously Native studies or Indigenous studies, indigigogy, whatever you want to call it, those are kind of like the trailblazers of bringing Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being into academia. But a lot of work has also been done by, social workers, folks in education, to, bring those ideas into this space. But really very little work has been done within business, or like we call it management studies or organizational studies, whatever you want to call it. And just my own experience has been, it's really hard to explain to, my senior colleagues in my discipline why Indigenous methodologies are so important. Or like not just important, like necessary. Like you cannot do research on Indigenous peoples. You have to, work harder, learn a lot more before you just like jump into a research project on Indigenous peoples, right? Like you need to do research that meets the needs of Indigenous peoples, that benefits Indigenous peoples, and is directed by Indigenous peoples and in partnership with Indigenous peoples. And to do that takes a lot of self-work, like particularly if you're a person who, like, your awareness of Indigenous peoples is what's been demonstrated in the media, which is often like very negative messaging, a lot of like really hateful rhetoric towards Indigenous peoples. You have to break that down before you can even like think you're safe to be entering an Indigenous community, and especially writing stuff up and publishing it in academic journals. And that's a problem that is happening in business still, where people who have absolutely no community connection, have never taken an interest in Indigenous peoples or cared about Indigenous peoples before. Now that there's, increased research funding around Indigenous peoples, it's just seen as an opportunity to get funding. And there hasn't been a lot of like structure built up within business to understand like you can't just do it. You need to like really commit with your heart and soul to this work, and not say it's going to be one project. It's going to be your whole life, like your whole research career if you get into it, or else like it's kind of problematic to just, dip in, get what you can because there's funding available, and then be like, see ya. So this brings me to self-location, which is kind of like the fundamental first step or preparatory step towards developing an Indigenous methodology, which is essential or necessary to do Indigenous focused research. And it's rooted in, like I mentioned earlier, Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. So when I started this interview, I said, Tansei, Teddy Carter, Utinia, Amaskasi, Teddy Carter, Nitsi Kesa, and Amaskasi, Utinia. So I'm telling you where I'm from, what my name is, and that's like kind of the bare minimum of just introducing yourself. And if you have spent much time in Indigenous community, everyone asks you where you're from. And they don't just mean like, oh, I'm from Edmonton. really what they're asking is like, who is your family? Who's your community? Do you have any stories you can share that we can share together? So it's kind of like a cultural exchange that builds relationships and trust with one another, so we know each other. And like, especially in Edmonton, when you're introducing yourself, or when I'm introducing myself in community, like I'm always meeting people who it's like, oh, we're actually related. Like we're cousins, or like maybe we're cousins, but it's like 7 generations back. Like we can trace back, a lot of us can trace back our, ancestors that far and really figure out how we're related. Sometimes you're related on a couple of lines of the tree. But it's that, like, if you're going to speak about your community, you first have to step forward and say, I'm a member of this community and I am accountable to that community for what I say. So if I'm going to go out and be like, oh, like my grandpa was in the Michelle band and like I'm a Michelle person, then they're going to be listening, right? My community is going to be listening and they're going to be like, is she saying something that is really offensive about Indigenous people and she's just using our name because she has some sort of like tentative, historical connection? Or is she doing this respectfully and relationally to our community? So it's that respectfulness, that accountability, that's like one aspect of self-location. That's not always possible, right? Like there are people who don't know, like they know who their parents are, they might know who their grandparents are, but they don't know anything beyond that. And that happens a lot with diasporic communities. Like even if you were to consider like what did Stephen Harper call it? The old stock Canadians. Like those really like people who were settler Canadians who go back generations and generations as settlers. There's still a lot of like detachment from that kind of like understanding of where you come from and what your relationship to the land is, and being able to speak on it, being able to write on it, and feeling good about being able to do that instead of feeling like I have no idea where to even begin. It's a process, like I said, a preparatory process of something you should do before you even consider entering into a research partnership with Indigenous peoples, to be safe, to come to terms with who you are, to understand what your biases are. So if I ask you, I don't want to put you on the spot. Yeah. If I ask a person, just a student in my class, for example, what is your relationship to the land? Like some of them will not even have an idea how to respond to that. If I ask, what is your relationship to Canada, like Indigenous peoples in Canada or Indigenous peoples who are from this traditional territory, they'll have absolutely no idea how to even like process that question, let alone answer it. Yeah. So it's a research project for me, coming to understand more deeply over time through reading, through interactions in community, through my teaching, what self-location means and what it means for me as a researcher and just like as a human being, like getting in touch with myself. But it also kind of like disseminates out from that into my teaching, where I get my students to self-locate as a part of their coursework, where I bring it into my research and, speak about it at conferences or whatnot.
Yeah, no, that's actually kind of amazing. Just the fact that you are able to, like, you guys can come together and trace back so far. Like, I can speak for myself when I say I would also have no idea how to answer a question like that. Like, what is my relationship to the land? But again, I haven't really ever learned about any of that.
Yeah, and it takes some consideration and maybe like
Yeah.
reading what other people have said, and then like, you know, some students break down and, you know, struggle with it a lot. And that's totally okay because like we're all on our different journeys, right? Like we're all coming to this from a different viewpoint, and sometimes it is really hard. Like sometimes we don't think about who our family is because it's hurtful to think about who they are. Like it brings up some sort of like negative feelings that people don't or have been like spending time trying not to think about. And then the idea of like writing that down and submitting it to your teacher. So I'm always like, you don't have to disclose anything. Like, this is a safe space. Like, you have boundaries. You don't need to disclose. And like, same goes for research. Like, I think when you're getting into it, a lot of the time it can feel kind of like, oh, I've got to talk about all the sad things, because those are like, when we have something sad or painful, it's like so forward in our heart. It just like comes out as soon as you like start to scratch the surface. And like it can help to like, definitely I think like psychologists say, oh, do your journaling or whatever, talk about your sad things. But it like self-location, you don't have to like sit there and write your whole sad story for the world to read out, right? It's like your boundaries of what you're comfortable with. A lot of the time for Indigenous researchers, it's like I will not talk about certain things outside of my community, or this is private information for me. And you know, that is true for everyone. Like, you don't have to, but it's like, why are you doing this research? Show what your connection is to this community you want to do this research project with. What led you to this? What stories do you have that like led you to do this research? And some people can, you know, write a lot of really interesting little tidbits of things that have happened throughout their research that form this kind of constellation of like a whole picture of why they got into it. And some people are just, you know, well, I can just say that I like, for example, for a non-Indigenous researcher, they might just say I'm non-Indigenous. But I feel extremely strongly about, you know, supporting doing work that benefits Indigenous peoples, and that's what drives me. And like, that's also like sometimes good enough just to acknowledge, like, look what I'm doing. I'm not a member of the community, but, you know, I'm making these statements of my commitment to this work and like my reasons for this commitment, and that can still be really powerful.
Yeah. No, I love the idea of, before even beginning to go into like the research side, having a solid understanding of who you are in relationship to everything. Like, I think that's such an important way of thinking and approaching something.
Oh yeah, and I'm totally biased, so I'm like, oh, this is good. It's not just good for Indigenous focused research, it's good for any type of research, because, you know, if you understand the philosophy of science, you realize that there's implicit bias in all sciences, right? Like, maybe a little less so in hard sciences like math and physics, but like biological sciences, healthcare, education, everywhere you go, there's like these kind of baked in biases that aren't even like put in front of your face explicitly.
Yeah.
And like, if you haven't self-located, then it's really hard to, you know, be aware of your positioning and then relate it to what's going on and advocate for yourself, or advocate for, you know, a position that you think is maybe harmful to other people. But yeah, it's like good for all, sorry, that was like a total digression, but it's like good for all disciplines, whether it's Indigenous focused or not. It's just like a really like helpful tool to like lead you in your work in life. It's good for outside of research. Like as a student, like I don't know, when I first started out in school, I was just like so confused about what to do in university and what I was going to do after university. And I'm like, oh, this would have been really helpful to like be led through this little more like, feeling exercise and like self awareness exercise before like launching into this really expensive and time consuming endeavor.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been there. I think we can all relate a little bit to that. But yeah. So I do want to move on a little bit, because another thing that you had mentioned previously is that you had recently gotten a cultural tattoo from one of your cousins, and I was hoping to learn more about that and what that experience was like.
Oh, yeah. So, like, at the time, I was dating this tattoo artist, and we went to, like, the Edmonton. This was, like, maybe, okay, take it back. This was maybe, like, in the late 2010s.
Okay.
And we went to this tattoo convention, like the Edmonton Tattoo Convention, whatever it's called. And, like, this was at the same time I was, like, really struggling in my PhD work because I felt like none of my senior colleagues were supportive of, Indigenous viewpoints. And so I was just like kind of really in like a frustrated space. And at the same time, like I'm doing more like self-location work and like trying to get to know myself, that kind of stuff. And I went to this tattoo convention. There was this tattoo, or like you could call him a cultural tattoo practitioner, Dion Kazes, who's like, he's sort of like brought this movement in a big way, helped to lead this movement in a big way in Canada. And he was there at the convention, and I was just sort of like looking at his table and his drawings and stuff. Like, I think he had some like examples of his work, but I was too shy to talk to him. And then eventually, like, I contacted him and talked to him like a few times and began to think like, I think Dion's from Thompson Rivers, so and I'm sorry I'm blanking on the Indigenous name for that location, but I started to think, okay, I want a tattoo from Dion just to like support his work, and because I think it's so important. Because what it is, it's like the Indigenous cultural tattoo revival is like reviving a practice. Like Indigenous cultural tattooing was a ceremony, like a part of ceremony for many Indigenous communities across the globe, not just in Canada, not just North America. I'm talking like almost every community has some sort of tattoo tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to support bringing this tradition back because it has some really deep meaning to it, in terms of healing for Indigenous peoples, in terms of community connection, in terms of connection to the land. Okay, we're reviving it. Why does it need to be revived? Because many people don't know, like, Indigenous ceremonies were made illegal in Canada, so you could be arrested as an Indigenous person for taking part in traditional ceremonies. So a lot of like our ceremonial practices were lost, or kind of like made so very few people had any awareness to carry it on. So this is a part of like a larger Indigenous cultural resurgence after like that political act to try to, disappear Indigenous peoples. So it's really important for that reason. It really resonated with me at the time because I was like, I'm in this academic space where they want me to like disappear myself as an Indigenous person and just like act like a business scholar and not feel like the more important thing for me to prioritize is my responsibility to Indigenous peoples. So then I started, looking at who's in the Indigenous cultural tattoo community, and I see like it's Keith Callahoo, which his mom was the chief of the Michelle band for some time. And but I never knew him before then. But Callahoo is like the big name in my community, and like my great grandma's last name was Callahoo. So like we were able to like figure out who our common ancestors are and stuff like that. And we just like, I went out to a tattoo gathering. I think it might have been in Merritt, BC, but I can't remember. And Keith was working that cultural gathering, so he did like this work. I don't know if there's any point in showing it around, but he did like a hand poke tattoo for me. Like we got started on it there, and it was really neat because like we just like clicked as like, when you meet a family member and you can like share some similar stories and like gossip and stuff like that. So like that's been like an awesome experience. And like, so he's kind of like worked on this tattoo, and what I wanted was like, I had looked at traditional motifs for Mohawk markings, because like I mentioned earlier, my community is very like Mohawk proud. They like call themselves the Western Mohawk or whatever. Even though, like I said, we're Métis Cree as well, and like obviously settler heritage as well. So I wanted something that, spoke to our community identity. Like throughout my childhood, like my mom and her family they'd always make comments about, oh, Mohawks do it like this, like that kind of stuff. So I was like, and Keith is like that too. Like he's very Mohawk forward as well. So it was kind of like neat to see and like just like get that community validation. That's not just, some people, this is like the way we are as a community. Anyway, so yeah, like the motif that I originally wanted, which, if you're listening, you cannot see it, but I can just describe like the two motifs that I was interested in originally are it's like the Haudenosaunee sky dome motif, which you can Google at. And also, so I got the Haudenosaunee sky dome motif as well as the Hiawatha wampum belt motif. Like there's a lot of story to that, which I don't really want to like get too into. And then later we added the Mohawk women's flag, and there's like some sun rays which are like about integrity. So like when I look down and I see that, I'm like, I better be on my perfect behavior because I have this marking on me. And when I say perfect behavior, I mean like those values of like integrity, honesty, like love, respect, kindness, wisdom, those kind of like those are kind of like, that's like I'm just rattling off like pan-Indigenous values that like they call them the 7 grandfather teachings or the 7 sacred teachings. But like if you get more into, your local teachings, if you like can get together with an elder and really get deep into it, like obviously there's like so much more than that top layer that I'm kind of describing now, but it just reminds me like I have to be my best behavior. I have some like accountability, especially like now that I'm a professor, which that I take that responsibility as like a constant reminder that there's people looking to me. And I did this for a reason, not just to like, yeah, I want some financial security, but I could have, gone work at a bank or something like that. But I chose this route.
Yeah, which is really like really cool if you think about it, because everything you talk about, it's all about culture, it's all about community and about sharing community and all of that. And I think teaching is a great way to be a part of a different sort of community and everything. But with that community angle in mind, I was wondering if there are any ways that you've been able to apply your research within your community with this self-location and with these land-based ways of learning.
Okay, well, thank you for asking. So yeah, like I'm thinking a lot about like how can I apply this? Like it's like okay to deal in ideas, but what does that mean? So like I had mentioned, like the land based, like trying to like come to some sort of like understanding of how I could develop a land-based learning course. One thing that I got involved in right away when I started at MacEwan was the community garden, which I don't know if anyone knows, but we have a community garden. Like it's on the 107th Street Keyhole, and it's only open during the summer. It's like a bunch of big planters where we have, you know, kind of like various crops like lettuce and herbs and tomatoes, but we also have some native plant beds, so like plants that are indigenous to this area. And so a part of that, I was like, oh, maybe we should grow tobacco. I talked to George at Keowatchiston. He's the knowledge keeper there. And he was like, oh, I don't know, Teddy. I don't know, which is like totally fair because, like without, you know, co-opting George's words, I think the general sentiment is just like, you want to be in relationship with plant medicines. And like there's something, I guess, like a little like dissociating when you're cultivating a crop, where like that plant isn't kind of in its, you know, community, so to speak. And if there's any like botanists or like plant science people out there, you know what I'm talking about. But also the other side of that discussion is, okay, so a lot of, you know, indigenous peoples are going out to like cigarette shops or whatever and buying tobacco there. And that stuff's really expensive. And it's being grown like in these different, like extremely, like I want to say dehumanizing for human beings, yes, like that kind of like mass crop production. There's going to be some like human exploitation to it, but also like maybe like depersonizing for the plants as well. Like they aren't being, you know, treated relationally in those types of environments. And then like that tobacco gets treated in ways, right? Like they add chemicals to it and stuff. And that's often what ends up getting given for protocol, because not everyone is able to like access, you know, wild grown, respectfully harvested tobacco. So like my reasoning is, well, maybe it's a better alternative that I can potentially grow tobacco here on campus with the involvement of the community, with the awareness of the community, and letting community give their opinions and, you know, being open to those kinds of discussions, but also maybe providing a little bit of like a service for folks on campus who maybe don't have access to wild tobacco and would like to have access to tobacco for protocol or for, you know, ceremonial purposes. So yeah, we started growing some tobacco. George actually gave me some seeds, so thank you so much, George. And we've been growing it this summer in the community garden, and you know, it's looking nice.
So you've actually been able to start growing.
Yeah, I think we got like 4 or 5 plants out there.
Oh wow.
It's not like a huge grow up or anything like that.
But just like something small that you can kind of use. Like,
like you had said. Like test out how
Yeah.
does this go? Like, what is it even like to grow tobacco? Like, I try to grow it on my patio. I live like in an apartment, so I try to grow it on my patio, and like it grows so small. And I think that's because it's like it needs a lot of nutrients and
Mm-hmm.
space and stuff. So
Yeah. How have you found it here at the community garden?
we've got like a few big ones going there for for sure. So like the next step, like you're not supposed to harvest it until it's matured and the leaves start to turn yellow, and then like you do kind of like a particular type of drying or curing process so that like like you want it to be something that could be smoked eventually. If you just like let it dry out, then it comes kind of crinkly and really dry where it will just like burn up and not really be good for smoking.
Yeah.
So really it's just like kind of a learning process right now of like how do we do this? How do we, make sure the community is aware of it, at least like the community for me, like thinking like the Kiowacistan community, um, hearing people's opinions, trying to get people involved, whether it's like just through discussion or, coming out and like taking part in taking care of the tobacco, and maybe like creating a space where we can share what we know about tobacco, like a place for that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's cool to see some of these like land-based things being put into practice and being able to be put into practice here. Because I don't think I see that a lot, especially, Western institution and everything. So I think it's really cool and inspiring to know that stuff like that is happening.
Oh,
So,
glad you like
yeah.
it.
So with that being said, I'm just to kind of wrap up here. Why, why do you feel that this research is relevant and meaningful to do today, like in today's world?
In today's world, well,
Like,
there's like a million reasons, but okay,
yeah.
let me think the things that come to mind first and foremost, like supporting Indigenous students, Indigenous staff, Indigenous faculty, because sometimes you get to the university and it's not such a nice place to be, where you feel like really isolated as an Indigenous person, and really like you have to leave that part of yourself at the door and just kind of like be what other people are exhibiting within the university. So building something that, promotes that kind of like connection to culture, connection to community within this institution, which like, I wouldn't want to stay here as a professor if I couldn't do this kind of work. So like that has the layer of like retaining a Indigenous faculty member in a faculty that doesn't have any other. Well, no, I think there might be one or two other. No, that was rude of me to say. There are other, but what I'm trying to say is like Indigenous faculty members will often leave the job because they feel like it's not, socially safe, or it's not work that they feel is like allowing them to do work for their community. Indigenous students will leave if they feel like it's not, something that works for them and their values, their community values. So just like create like changing the space to make it, friendlier for Indigenous folks, to say it simply. And then also, we mentioned that sustainability aspect of business that's getting more popular. Like, I don't know, I think that's like a real incredible issue that, we have kind of lost touch with, our relationship with the land. And, we're seeing the effects, like, it's kind of bouncing back towards us. Like, if you aren't in a good relationship with the land, if you treat it with disrespect, then it's gonna, you're gonna feel that disrespect back. I think that's happening a bit. Well, a lot, and I think it's urgent. And so I really value the environmental stewardship that Indigenous peoples have had in place since time immemorial. And, I think that there's a lot that we could all benefit from by being more engaged with the land in a respectful way. So there's that. Also, just like from a mental health standpoint, a healing standpoint, healing for our communities, for Indigenous communities, for non-Indigenous communities, it's just really good to have that connection to the land, because, it's like, and saying the land, like, that can mean a lot of things, but just going out and gardening together or sitting in a circle and beading together, having that, like, quiet, productive, peaceful space to come together and have conversation in is a really strong community building tool.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you so much for coming and talking with us today and being able to have these conversations.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Well, that's all we have for today's episode of Research Recasted. If you want to support this podcast, you can visit Research Recasted on your favorite podcast platforms to find new episodes every 2 weeks. Also, don't forget to check us out on Instagram at Research Recasted, where you can give us a like, leave us a follow, or send us any follow-up questions you have from today's episode. This has been Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization Podcast, brought to you by the Office of Research Services and the Faculty of Fine Arts and Communications at MacEwan University.